Before we begin today's episode, we'll be discussing international security, military strategy, and global power dynamics. These topics can involve ongoing geopolitical tensions and evolving information. Our goal is to analyze the strategic implications thoughtfully and responsibly, while recognizing that real people and real nations are affected by these decisions. As always, we encourage listeners to approach the conversation with curiosity, context, and respect for the complexity of global events.
Every major action on the world stage sends a message, not just to the country involved, but to every nation watching. And this week, the message from the United States was loud. The coordinated strikes with Israel against Iranian targets weren't just about one moment, one decision, or one conflict. They were a signal about deterrence, about alliances, about what lines actually mean in a world where threats are increasingly tested. But the interesting thing about signals is that they're interpreted differently depending on who's watching. To Tehran, the message may be force. To allies, it may be reassurance. To rivals like China and Russia, it becomes a data point, another piece of information about how far the United States is willing to go and under what circumstances. And in global politics, perception can be as powerful as action itself. So tonight we're stepping back from the immediate headlines and asking a bigger question. What message is America sending to the world right now? Is it strength, stability, or strategic risk? Let's break it down. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this conversation sits right at the intersection of strategy and perception. Brian's here, and I know he's going to argue that decisive action restores deterrence, that when America enforces its red lines, adversaries think twice. Rachel will help separate the emotional reaction from the strategic implications. Daniel is going to zoom out and look at the larger chessboard, what Beijing, Moscow, and regional actors are actually calculating right now. And Skylar will likely raise the question of long-term stability, whether military signaling strengthens alliances or risks widening conflict. And me, I want to understand the signal. Because in geopolitics, the audience isn't just the country involved in the conflict, it's every government watching how power is used. Let's start here. When a country like the United States takes decisive military action alongside a close ally like Israel, it's never just tactical, it's communicative. Governments around the world watch closely because they're constantly recalibrating their own decisions based on what they see. China watches to understand how the U.S. might respond to aggression in the Pacific. Russia watches to gauge American appetite for confrontation. Allies watch to see whether security guarantees are credible. So, Brian, let me start with you. From your perspective, what message did this week send to the world? Did it restore deterrence? Or does decisive action always risk escalating the very tensions it's meant to control?
Artie, the message is actually pretty straightforward. Deterrence still exists. For years, adversaries have tested the boundaries of American response through proxy actions, indirect threats, and regional destabilization. Iran funding militant groups, Russia pushing territorial lines, China expanding influence in contested waters. All of it operates on the assumption that the United States will hesitate before acting directly. So when the U.S. and Israel conduct coordinated strikes, that hesitation disappears. It signals that certain actions will carry consequences. That's the foundation of deterrence. Not aggression, but credibility. If red lines exist but are never enforced, they stop being red lines. They become suggestions. And credibility matters globally. China absolutely watches how the U.S. responds to threats against allies. If they see consistency and willingness to act, it changes their calculations in places like Taiwan. Russia watches it as well, especially in how the U.S. balances escalation with restraint. Now, does action carry risk? Of course it does. Every strategic move does. But in my view, allowing adversaries to operate without consequence carries far greater long-term risk. Deterrence isn't about starting wars. It's about preventing them by making the cost of aggression clear. So the signal I think the world saw this week was that the United States is willing to back its alliances with action, not just statements.
Brian, I think what you're describing is the logic behind deterrence itself, the idea that credibility prevents escalation rather than causes it. And historically, there's evidence that when adversaries believe consequences are real, they become more cautious. But the other side of that argument is perception, because what one nation calls deterrence, another nation may interpret as provocation. and perception in international politics can move very quickly. Rachel, let me bring you in here. When analysts look at an event like this, they're not just examining the strike itself, they're studying how different global actors interpret it. So, from a strategic standpoint, how might different audiences, allies, rivals, and neutral nations read the message America just sent?
I think the key word there is audiences, because international actions rarely send a single message. They send multiple signals simultaneously, depending on who's interpreting them. For close allies, particularly Israel and NATO partners, decisive action can reinforce confidence. Security alliances depend heavily on credibility. When an ally sees that the United States is willing to act in coordination with partners, it strengthens the perception that mutual defense commitments are meaningful. For rivals, the interpretation is more complex. China and Russia tend to analyze not just the action but the context. How limited it was, how quickly diplomacy follows, how domestic opinion reacts. They're studying patterns. Was this a one-time enforcement of a specific line, or does it signal a broader willingness to escalate? And then there are neutral or non-aligned nations. For them, these moments often raise concerns about regional stability. They're less focused on deterrence theory and more focused on whether tensions might spill into wider conflict. So the signal isn't singular, it's layered. Allies may see reassurance. Rivals may see a test of boundaries. Neutral nations may see increased volatility. That's why messaging after an action like this becomes just as important as the action itself.
Rachel, that layered perception is exactly why these moments matter beyond the immediate conflict. Because the strike itself may last hours, but the interpretation lasts months or years. Daniel, let's zoom out to the broader chessboard here. When global powers evaluate American decisions, they're looking for patterns, not just single events. So how might China and Russia interpret this moment? Does it reinforce American strength in their calculations? Or does it become another data point in how they test the limits of U.S. response elsewhere?
Artie, when major powers like China and Russia observe events like this, they're not reacting emotionally. They're analyzing patterns. Every military action, every diplomatic response, every alliance coordination becomes data in a larger strategic model. China, in particular, studies American decision-making through the lens of deterrence and resolve. Beijing's leadership constantly evaluates how the United States responds when allies are threatened or when regional stability is challenged. That matters for scenarios in the South China Sea or Taiwan. If China believes the US will act decisively in defense of partners, it changes the risk calculation for aggressive moves. Russia views it somewhat differently. Moscow often focuses on whether American action remains limited or expands. If they see a strike, followed by diplomatic containment and no broader escalation, they may interpret that as controlled signaling rather than open confrontation. In other words, they're watching the boundaries of American willingness. But the most important thing both nations observe is consistency. Strategic credibility doesn't come from a single action. It comes from repeated patterns over time. If actions align with stated commitments, credibility increases. If actions appear unpredictable or inconsistent, adversaries begin testing those gaps. So, from a geopolitical standpoint, what happened this week becomes part of a longer narrative about how the United States exercises power and how predictable that power is.
Daniel, that's the part that often gets overlooked. These moments aren't isolated events. They're chapters in a larger story about credibility. And credibility isn't just about strength. It's about predictability. Allies want to know they can rely on you. Rivals want to know where the boundaries are. But Skylar, I know you look at another side of this equation, or at the long-term stability question. Because while deterrence theory focuses on preventing aggression, critics argue that repeated military signaling can increase tension cycles over time. So, from your perspective, does this kind of action strengthen global stability, or risk deepening the confrontational atmosphere between major powers?
I think the concern many people have isn't about strength itself. It's about escalation dynamics. In international relations, actions often trigger reactions, which trigger counter reactions. Even when the original intention is deterrence, the perception of threat can cause adversaries to respond defensively or aggressively. And when nations begin interpreting each other's signals through suspicion, tension can accumulate quickly. Military actions, alliance shifts, and strategic messaging all interact in ways that sometimes move faster than diplomacy can catch up. That's why some analysts emphasize the importance of balancing deterrence with clear communication. If actions are paired with diplomatic signals explaining boundaries and intent, it can prevent misunderstandings from spiraling. The challenge is maintaining that balance. Demonstrating strength while still leaving room for de-escalation is one of the hardest tasks in global leadership. So I think the real test after an event like this isn't just the strike itself. It's what happens next. Do diplomatic channels stay open? Do tensions stabilize? Or does each side interpret the moment as justification for further confrontation?
I think that's the tension at the heart of global power politics. Deterrence is meant to prevent conflict, but deterrence also requires actions that can look confrontational in the moment. And what tonight's conversation shows is that every move on the global stage carries multiple interpretations. Allies may see reassurance, rivals may see a challenge, neutral nations may see risk. That's why credibility and clarity matter so much. When nations understand the boundaries, stability becomes more likely. When boundaries feel uncertain, testing begins. The United States has always operated in that space, balancing strength with diplomacy, action with restraint. This week's event sent a signal. The real story will be how that signal is interpreted in the months ahead. Because in geopolitics, perception doesn't just shape reactions, it shapes the future. That's the conversation.
All right, before we wrap things up, let's take a quick second to thank the community that keeps this show going. Data Dissonance has always been about thoughtful conversations, not shouting matches, not headlines designed to inflame, but real discussion about the issues shaping our world. If you value independent voices and honest debate, one of the best ways to support the show is through our merch and coffee line. We've got the full lineup available: patriotic apparel, the Gen X designs, and some of our fan-favorite bumper stickers, like Make Orwell Fiction Again and Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms. It's gear for people who aren't afraid to think for themselves and represent it. And of course, the coffee blends are still a favorite. High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium, and Bitterroot Dark French Roast, roasted right here in the USA. If you're going to stay up late analyzing geopolitics and world events, you might as well do it with a strong cup of coffee. You can find everything at the merch store and through the website. Every purchase helps support the show and keeps these conversations independent. And we truly appreciate every one of you who's part of this community.
You know, when we talk about global events like this, it's easy to get lost in the headlines, the strikes, the statements, the reactions. But the real story of moments like this isn't just what happened this week. It's what those actions communicate about the kind of leadership a nation chooses to project to the world. For decades, the United States has carried a complicated role on the global stage. It's not just a military power, not just an economic power. It's a signal to allies about reliability, a signal to rivals about boundaries, and a signal to the rest of the world about how stability is maintained in a system where not every nation shares the same interests or values. And that responsibility isn't simple. Strength can deter conflict, but it can also raise tensions if it's misunderstood. Diplomacy can stabilize relationships, but it can also be interpreted as weakness if it lacks credibility. So global leadership has always lived in that narrow space between force and restraint. What matters most is consistency. Nations, just like people, build trust through patterns. When allies know you will stand with them, confidence grows. When adversaries understand the limits they shouldn't cross, stability increases. And when both strength and communication exist together, the chances of miscalculation shrink. That's the balance the United States has tried to maintain for generations, projecting power without recklessness, enforcing boundaries without abandoning diplomacy, and signaling that leadership means responsibility as much as capability. This week was one of those moments where the world watched closely, not just to see what happened, but to understand what it meant. And the truth is, The real message of moments like this isn't written in the first headline. It's written in what happens next, in how nations respond, how alliances hold, and whether the signal leads to stability or further testing. So we'll keep watching, keep asking questions, and keep having the conversations that try to make sense of a complicated world. Because understanding the signal matters. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller Series. Gripping political thrillers where global power, intelligence operations, and high-stakes decisions collide. If you enjoy the kind of conversations we have on this show about leadership, strategy, and the forces shaping the world, then you'll want to check out the Covenant Protocol and the Prophet Directive. These stories follow intelligence operative Caleb Rourke as he navigates shadow wars, global power struggles, and the dangerous line between security and chaos. And Book 3, Black Echo Rising. It's also brought to you by the music behind the show, the album Uncaged, Bold and Independent, and the country album Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, built on faith, freedom, and real American stories. Plus the single Stand Tall Charlie, a tribute to strong leadership and standing your ground when it matters most. You can find the books on Amazon, the music on Spotify, and all major streaming platforms, and everything connected to the show, merch, coffee, and more, on the website. Independent stories, independent music, independent thought. And that's what Data and Dissonance is all about.